Today's conversation is for anyone building a brand who believes that growth doesn't have to come at the expense of values. Our guest today is Justin, the founder behind Citizens, a brand that's not grown just across cities, but through genuine connection with the people who support it. Justin's path is unconventional. He started behind the scenes in finance before stepping fully into his operator role, scaling Citizens city by city while personally shepherding everything from menus to customer experience to storytelling and more. What truly sets Justin apart is how he's rethought ownership and community. By turning fans into partial owners through equity crowdfunding, he's built a supporter base that feels invested far beyond being regular customers, while maintaining careful alignment between growth and purpose at every stage. If you're interested in building a brand with meaning, fostering direct relationships with supporters, and fundraising outside of the traditional playbook, this conversation is for you. Justin, welcome to the show. To start, can you share a little bit more about your background and how Citizens came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me. So Citizens came to be, when I think back over the genesis, I moved to the US after being born and raised in Australia, coming from a finance background, growing up in and around restaurants as well. So I had this really nice kind of fusion of food and beverage industry alongside studying and then eventually working in finance. And then, just post-college really worked out that I wanted to focus on food and beverage brands as my career and got to use a lot of the finance and accounting background as well. Upon moving to the US at 21, I think one of the first things that happens when you move as a foreigner is you start to work out what are the things from home that you miss. And for me, Australia has just such a rich culture around the kind of all-day local cafe. And, the way that we view that concept is so different to, I think, a lot of the world, where there's so much innovation in our cafe industry, away from supply chain to some of the best, chefs and kind of operators and baristas that work in cafes, and a lot of, great supply chain, guest experience. So, Australia's cafe scene is just so advanced versus, I think, the rest of the world. And, you see that now. There's a lot of kind of Australian influence, even in these big public companies like Starbucks that are importing concepts like the flat white and smashing avocado. So I think coming to the US and coming to New York, that was one of the first things that I missed. Is like New York is just such an incredible, one of the greatest cities in the world. But really I missed that local, specialty cafe that did an all-day amazing breakfast, great coffee, really warm hospitality with kind of baristas who know you by name, face, and order.
Right.
So I think just by virtue of missing that, I started to dream up this brand, that would be transporting this awesome cafe culture in my mind to New York. And so it began there. I met my business partner Andrew in New York, and we were both around 22. We wrote our first business plan on a really shoestring budget and opened our first Citizens location for under $100,000, which in New York City restaurants, that's like a Hail Mary. I think we got laughed out of a fair few meetings, but we did it. We got it open. We managed to scrape on by, and then that first year of Citizens was just such a hit success for us. Also came with a ton of failures as well with the success. We fumbled a lot, learnt a lot on the go, and now today I think we're at such an exciting juncture. We've got locations across New York, Austin, Houston, San Antonio this year as well. And we've got these grand plans to be this national brand that really kind of spreads that concept.
Yeah, that sounds great. You touched on a few points there that were really interesting. With your background in food and beverage, were you always passionate about coffee or the cafe lifestyle, or where was your background really lie there?
Yeah, well, I think it's around mostly to do with the concept. When I think beyond the product, I'm not a chef by trade or an award-winning barista or a bartender. For me, it was just conceptually this concept of a highly driven, innovative neighborhood cafe that does, really great all-day breakfast, lunch, and dinners with a great supply chain. Specialty coffee, you roast your own coffee, you source it. I think that kind of concept, innately is what we call very sticky, because, if you think about your local, French brasserie, your Italian restaurant, your local steakhouse, you typically patronize those restaurants in a lesser cadence. You might go there once a month, once a quarter, a couple times a year. When I think about an Australian cafe, healthy food and great coffee, offered to you in a full service or a to-go format, you're there every day. You find your favorite local cafe, you're there every day because it's a very sticky experience. So
Right.
I love that. I loved what comes with that frequency is just such great locals and regulars and great hospitality where you really get to know your neighborhood and your locals. And that's just a cornerstone of the Citizens brand. It's all in the name. Citizens of, you really
Right.
localize your local restaurant for the citizens of that neighborhood and that little postcode, zip code, as we call it here.
Right, yeah, and really focusing on that community aspect. So, starting a company in New York City and a restaurant as well is, definitely a big obstacle, I would say. But what really led you to say, let me open up a business in New York? And then also, what led you to opening up the Texas locations for your business specifically? And then, if there are founders out there, what should they consider when deciding where to operate or to grow their business?
Yeah, for sure. I think that question is really important, and that's really focused around the kind of geographic strategy of where you operate. I think our story is a really good story of learning because we first opened in New York and started operating in New York. I think we were much younger entrepreneurs and operators at that point, and we simply opened in New York because that's the city that we lived and we knew well, and we just love that culture. So that was that was done from more of like a personal standpoint and strategy. But I think where a lot of the craft came in is when we decided to start expanding nationally and had to really think hard through how do you choose that next market. So I think your question is a really good one because the first half of our journey in New York was from a personal standpoint. The latter years of expanding, we really tried to come away from the idea of where do we want to do business from a personal point of view and really start to lean into the idea of if we really study this question and really choose the right markets to expand through, what it does give you in the end is it mitigates so much risk from your expansion profile.
Right.
So for us, we lent away from the idea of where do we want to be personally and started to lean into what are the markets that Citizens, on a brand proposition or business proposition going to be so differentiated and where the consumers are going to really love and kind of receive the brand super well.
Mm-hmm.
And then where economically can we really kind of get ahead and where's it going to make sense to, scale the business through in terms of profitability or cost structures. So we studied up all these different markets. We had this funny couple of years of flying around the country, studying what we call macro factors, which is for us, the macro factors is, what is the kind of net migration patterns of certain markets? What are the growth, the economic growth of those markets? How powerful is the economy in certain cities and states? And then started to study some of the more kind of micro factors, which are when you get boots on the ground, what's the competition landscape look like for your business? What is some of the kind of state specific or kind of economics? Like what are the labor conditions there? What do people typically pay their labor force in those markets? And then we combined all that by studying the most comparable brands to us. So when we looked in the all-day cafe segment, and really restaurants that looked and felt like us that had scaled, we started to work out those that have a national brand presence, do they do above their national average or below their national average in those cities and states? And you can start to use all these data points of, okay, you can start to predict your sales volume based on comparable brands. And then you get an idea of lower cost structures, lower competition landscapes. And there's really markets that start to really illuminate and shine pretty brightly to you. When you do that kind of analysis, it's not a guessing game. You look at the data for what it is and you start to make these bold assumptions and guesses on how your business is going to perform. And I'm so glad that we did that. We got a lot of that direction from some of our mentors. And what that led to for us is when we opened our first location in Houston, it outperformed any New York City opening that we've done.
Yeah.
And
Great.
I mean, if you stand back and think about that, it's mind-boggling. The sheer volume and cachet of New York, to think that we have locations in Texas that outperform on a sales volume. I'm not even talking about profitability yet. On a sales volume is mind-boggling. And I think it comes down to, all these factors I just talked about, density of competition, the operating capacity, because there's lower rents here and bigger spaces, you can push high sales.
Right.
So it's all this really strong analysis that we did, and I'm so glad that we did. When you go into business, as you know, you pour your capital, your life, your time, all this investment into it. So if you don't do that analysis, you're kind of you're starting from behind.
Right.
And so I'm so glad that we chose Texas. I think Texas is a huge, huge fit for us. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so Houston was great. Austin's been even better for the brand, and now San Antonio is next up, and we're expanding in New York, but we're really heavily expanding in Texas.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much opportunity there. And I think it's really important that you brought up diving into analytics side of things, reviewing your competition. Often we can get really excited about an idea and say, oh no, it'll do so well here. And you just go for it without really looking through the data and actually seeing what works. Definitely very eye-opening though that Houston, I feel like foot traffic wise, my mind would go to New York City would be significantly busier. But Austin is definitely a city we see filling up with a lot of people pretty fast. San Antonio, I was there a few years ago, like near the Riverwalk. It was getting more and more trendier, more community-driven location, so I could totally see a location there too. Have you ever heard of the kookaburra before?
Well, we have Kookaburra is our national bird, or
No. I went to St. Augustine, and in downtown St. Augustine, there was a place called the Kookaburra. And it was actually really busy, but it was a Australian coffee place, and they sold Aussie pies, which were very good. That was a pretty popular spot, so just keep that in mind.
Well, St. Augustine, that's Florida, right?
Yes.
I mean, it goes along with what I was saying earlier, is that, Australian cafes are expanding across the globe. Like, they're really becoming a really colloquial concept, and it's not, I think on the coasts of the US, certainly so. Like, I think about San Francisco, LA, San Diego now, New York. There's Australian cafe presence everywhere, and you've got massive publications like New York Times, Vogue. They've all done pieces on us, but pieces on a lot of great brands, and it makes me happy to see that, because I think Australia is really getting, Australian hospitality brands are getting their flowers, because this is a concept and a little segment that we do that we know really well and we do well at. So It makes me happy to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, the coffee shop was very busy, but like you said, I would say the menu was fairly health conscious. Coffee was great, but it did bring that community aspect to the area. Like people kind of found the coffee shop, and you could tell there was a lot of foot traffic where people would go to it daily. We're going to pivot to a little bit different now. You moved from a finance background into a very hands-on role. What really drove that shift, and how has that influenced the way that you've built Citizens? What made you really want to step away from the finance aspect and focus more on running your own business?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think I talk about this a lot. I think for me, finance was such a good start, an early start to my career, that gave me a lot of analytical skill sets and kind of a new line of thinking. People that know me well have always known that I've loved, more of this kind of people-focused, tactile, kind of passions in my life. And I think one thing that led me away from finance was, there wasn't a lot of interaction with the end result of your work. A lot of the work that you do, you spend hours and hours, days and weeks on it, and you kind of push go or complete, and you don't really get to interact with how that typically will affect a business, or see it kind of affect, your customer in a sense. So, where I started to really love restaurants is just purely around how creative and how people focused, that typically that work pulls you into. And I loved that. I loved the interacting and driving teams, building teams, coaching team members. So it's less technical, more leadership focused, and more kind of, let's call it, more, not just emotional, but it's more kind of people strategical, focus. So that's what led that transition for me. And one of the interesting things I noticed right away is, when I worked in finance, I'd work 45 hours a week. Now that I work in scaling, this restaurant brand, Citizens, I work, almost double that amount of hours. And what's funny is I find that I have more energy across my work and my business. I just remember being so tired and drained all the time in finance. And maybe that's passion talking, but I work double the amount of hours in this, very people-focused role, but I have twice the amount of energy. And I think what it showed me is that what you choose as your vocation, and how much that powers you and interests you and engages you, and it doesn't always have to be a out-and-out passion, but it permeates into your every other part of your life. The way that you are learning, the way that you're developing, that kind of powers your character, your confidence. So I think one of the coolest byproducts of Citizens is the kind of person that I've become. Like that alchemy of that process has been really, really great. I've noticed myself just develop a new level of confidence and character, and I've loved that. So, yeah, that's a big reason. That's the why behind what I did, and I've loved that transition. Now I've developed so many other layers and edges in my skill set around coaching and leading people. And that was a new frontier for me. It didn't happen overnight. It took years and years, even through Citizens, going from managing one set of people, more like frontline restaurant level operations, to then managing managers. How does that work? And then managing regional managers and more corporate level managers. So every jump that I've done has come with a pretty steep learning curve of like how to strategically think and talk and lead and coach, and it hasn't always been easy, but I think what I've always found is, like anything in life, when you feel a little bit uncomfortable and out of place, it's just a matter of time until you try to close the gap on that learning, and then you feel that level of fitness and maturity in your new role. So I love that. I'm always uncomfortable, but I'm at peace with it these days.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's always that quote where it's like, I stopped working 9 to 5 for someone else, so I can work 24/7 for myself. But I do think you end up learning a lot. Sometimes you just have to take that jump and try something new. And obviously it's worked out great. So something I think that's really interesting with entrepreneurship is you kind of learn a lot about different aspects of the business that you might not have been involved in before. I think that people part is really important. Managing people is definitely something that comes with learning, but it can be very rewarding too, and you get to really be hands-on with your job. So I think that's really exciting. Jumping into how you really came about in terms of the financial part of the business, you chose equity crowdfunding and turned customers into part owners of your business. What did this unlock for your business, and what surprised you the most about how people showed up once they were invested?
Yeah, it's a great question. We talk about this a lot because we've been very, very fortunate to have our customers play a huge part in now financing our growth and coming on the journey as capital partners, and sometimes beyond capital partners too. And it's a new frontier for startups, the equity crowdfunding round. And we were fortunately approached by a few different platforms who thought the Citizens brand would be a good fit. And now I understand why. I think for brands that have a heavy consumer-facing, or user-facing exposure, I think you start to develop some real loyalty and power with your customers. And, Citizens certainly has that. We've got this really huge online following, and that's getting bigger as we open more locations. And so, we chose equity crowdfunding because it was a mechanism in which we could achieve kind of two things in one for us, which is, we could fuel the growth of the brand, in taking on investment like you traditionally would. But we were also able to bring our customers on the ride, which really turned our local customers and regulars into, evangelists. It turns them into, they go beyond customers and regulars and more into what we call brand sneezers, who are people that are really now talking about your brand, not just as a loyal, customer. I love their coffee, I love their breakfast, or the tunes that they play, or the way it makes me feel when I go to Citizens. Now they're talking about, hey, they're talking about your strategy and where you're trying to go, and talking about your mission statement, because in turn they've become an owner. And so you really harness the power of your brand and awareness to your brand by taking on your biggest fans. I mean, it sounds so simple, right? Invite your biggest fans to invest in your company, and they're going to kind of shout the brand from the hills. And that's what happens. So we've found it to be Now, to call it a marketing tool doesn't do it justice because it's so much more than that. It's more of a branding tool. So that's been a big motivator for us. What we then found beyond that was the sheer, tenacity and kind of goodwill of these investors. I have a lot of great relationships where people reach out with recommendations. That could be within real estate, like trade areas or neighborhoods to look out for, or a lot of networking connections, people that want to help you develop your branding, want to come on board as, more official advisors. We've taken a lot of those investors on as, we built a relationship within a layer that then led to them becoming a more official advisor to the brand. And they've helped with 101 things, branding, marketing, investor relations. Now, one of my investor relations leads is a current investor for us. And so it comes with challenges in putting together that campaign. Is not easy and there's a lot of work involved. But I think what you get out of it, if done well, is more than capital. I think we've raised over $3 million now from the crowd. And for any startup, that's a lot of money, especially when you're in your opening phases. But what's come beyond that $3 million is the brand, the marketing, and the kind of support and advisory that you get from some of these folks. Like, we've had some mind-boggling people come out of the woodwork that we didn't even know were customers. We had like Randy Zuckerberg invest in Citizens and then become a really great advisor to the brand, within marketing, tech, and strategy. And we've done some awesome events with her and developed a great relationship with her. So there's been more examples of that. But I think I would encourage more startups to go and explore that avenue. If your brand plays within the high consumer or high kind of user, aspect, then I think you potentially could be a fit.
Right. That sounds great. It actually reminds me a lot of a conversation I recently had with Sean Tanu on the show, and he's a global branding expert. And one thing that he mentioned, we're going to see this trend more and more in order for brands or companies to really stay relevant, is to move from the storytelling to the story living piece. And once you have your own customers becoming brand ambassadors or advocates for your brand, that's really where they see a lot of the marketing going moving forward. It's no longer, this is our new marketing campaign, here's our new products. It's more so word of mouth from people that actually are passionate about your brand. It's not the easiest for someone in marketing to take a step back and be like, okay, let's have our customers run with this one. If you do have such a strong customer base, it really escalates your brand in a way that I don't think any real marketing budget could. I mean, if you have people that are actually so passionate about it, it goes such a long way. If any founders are considering going this route, what would you say is something they should really understand before taking a non-traditional path to raising capital?
It's a good question. I would think, I think first acknowledging that the sheer amount of work. I mean, there's embarking on an equity crowdfunding campaign, and then there's doing it well. And those two are really two different things. I would say to really research the process and the sheer amount of investment in terms of time, and sometimes even capital as well, to get going is going to could cost anywhere from like 15 to 30,000 just in the onboarding and the legal fees and audit fees. Beyond the capital, it's a lot of work to get the campaign up and running and to run a great campaign. It takes a lot of most of the successful campaigns are led by the founders or the owners, because there's a lot of trust building that you have to, I think, go through naturally in equity crowdfunding. You're raising as a private company from a lot of private investors, so they don't have that level of trust with you. They don't know you or the brand as well. You have to play a huge role in the marketing and the presence of it, because they have to they're investing in you as much as the brand. And so I think consider the sheer amount of time and investment that goes into it to do it well. Mm-hmm. And if that's something that, you feel at this current time you don't have, then I wouldn't embark on that journey, because in the end, it's not really worth the financial investment if it doesn't perform. And what I mean by perform is raising, upwards of, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. If you can get over that hill, that's worth it, because it's just the sheer amount of time and even money that you have to invest into it. It has to make sense. So that's one thing. And I also think, you need to think hard that is your business the right fit for it? Do you have a brand following? How strong is that brand following? Do you have a strong community that, that either supports your brand, that maybe not your customers today, but are interested? And so if you don't have those things today, I'm not sure it's a good fit, because they're the primary communities that you're trying to engage to really get involved.
Those are great tips. I think, if you have that sense of community already, it's just a great opportunity to further that. And as we're kind of wrapping up this episode and looking back, what's one mindset shift that has really helped you scale with purpose? And what would you pass on to founders that are trying to grow without losing their values?
Yeah, I think first, we did this a little bit later in Citizens, and I wish we did it earlier. I think first understanding what your brand pillars are. Not enough of us actually do that. Even for us, an Australian cafe, we had to think through what makes us special and what makes us tick and what's really separates Citizens as a brand. And once you can understand those little verticals and pillars, you can then start to understand how to make decisions around, are we really doubling down on supply chain because that makes us special? Are we doubling down on fun because we're a really fun brand? So how do we show up as fun? So I think that's something that we did later at Citizens. And, on my next ventures, I do that much, much earlier, pre-launch, really succinctly define the brand pillars and then kind of operate off those.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I really appreciate it, Justin. I will add the link to Citizens, your website, and the show notes.
Yeah, all of our social links are on our website. So, if you go to citizensallday.com, you'll find our Instagram handle, citizensallday. And then we're really, really active on all those platforms. So follow us there. LinkedIn, if you're more kind of business oriented and want business updates. I'm really transparent with our company performance. I put out CEO updates almost weekly. So feel free to follow us there and join the ride.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Branding with Facts. If you enjoyed it, I'd appreciate it if you rated and reviewed, and I will catch up with you all on next week's episode.